The last episode of this spectacular podcast, webcast, whatever the heck this is, the last one we did, the topic of a pre-buy inspection came up.
It
And
did.
somebody said we should do an episode on that. And somebody else said, great idea. And I don't know which one of us said what, but I think it's worth discussing. You've had pre-buys in your past, haven't you?
Yes, I have bought airplanes both with pre-buys and without pre-buys.
Me
And
too.
I've probably made well, you're an A&P. I mean, you can kind of do your own, but I probably made every mistake in the book. Yeah.
That's the thing. And I don't know that the pre-buy inspection is particularly well understood. And certainly there are people I deal with that say, I'm not spending $500 or $1,000 or $1,500 just on somebody to look at the plane I'm buying. And I got to say, Pat, I think that's the wrong attitude, because to spend 1% of the purchase price making sure it's not a dog, that's really cheap insurance.
Yeah, there was a flying club that I helped get started over in San Antonio, and they had their eyes set on a Cherokee 6. They had a very specific set of avionics that they wanted in it, and they found one over in Florida or Georgia, somewhere over on the East Coast, southeast coast, and um, and I told them, I said, make sure that you get a pre-buy on that thing, and I recommended to them a particular place that specializes in helping pilots find people to do pre-buys for them, and it cost $750 for that service, the service of helping to find someone to do the pre-buy and then supervise the pre-buy. $750. They found about $13,000 worth of discrepancies, including an unairworthy aileron repair.
Wow.
Yeah. So obviously, they renegotiated the purchase price. I had told them when they started looking, I said, that's great. Don't just remember, airplanes, they'll, if you don't find the one you want, there'll be another one that you'll find. Don't fall in love with the first one. Well, they fell in love with the first one, but they were able to negotiate the price down, and they got all the airworthiness issues taken care of. They came back home, and within about 24 hours, they had a brake failure. But it was airworthy when it left Georgia or Florida, wherever it was, and they've had that airplane now for 5 or 6 years, and they're quite happy with it.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I am an A&P, and I do a pretty good visual inspection on an airplane I'm going to buy, but I can easily get emotionally involved in the
Mhm.
purchase process. So I still hire somebody to do a pre-buy. I have bought planes without a pre-buy, and I've been fortunate,
Yeah,
but I've also gotten a pre-buy and saved myself boatloads of money,
right.
because, there was a couple of years ago, I was really seriously looking at a 172. Somebody I knew owned it. I'd flown it before. I'd done flight reviews in it. Absolutely beautiful airplane. The guy who owned it was a techno geek. So the panel was spectacular, had everything you could ever dream of. And he had just upgraded to a new 180 horsepower engine. I think I had 16 hours on it when
Oh my,
I went and checked it out. I mean, this was
yeah,
fantastic. He was offering it to me for a very reasonable price. It was towards the top of my limit, but it was
right.
reasonable for that airplane. I took it to get a pre-buy at a shop I work with routinely, and it was about $1,500. And I found out if I bought that airplane, I was probably going to spend an additional $20,000 to $30,000 on doing repairs that had been neglected for years and years, that you don't notice. I mean, the paint's nice, the interior is beautiful, the engine's new, the panel's great. Well, there's still a control system, there's still a fuel system, there's still all sorts of things like smoking rivets and corrosion under the skin that's like, oh, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And you would never see it. And that's really why you do the pre-buy, to make sure the airplane I think I'm buying is actually the airplane I'm buying.
Yeah, the 182, when I bought the 182 about, I guess it's been about 2.5 years ago now. I bought it from someone I've known for years. And in fact, I had flown that airplane many, many times in the previous years. And it came time for him to sell it, and we were able to, come to an agreement. But I did want a pre-buy on it because it had sat somewhat inactive for a while,
Mhm.
and multiple pilots were flying it just to kind of keep it going, right. And so for that reason, I wanted a pre-buy. We took it to a mechanic that we both know at another airport that really hadn't seen the airplane in probably 5 or 6 years. So it was fresh eyes essentially on the airplane, although he was familiar with it. And he found about $6,000 worth of stuff that really did need to be addressed. And to the owner, to the owner, he said, "Yeah, fix it all." And he absorbed that in the purchase price that we had already negotiated, subject to a successful pre-buy. So I got the airplane for the agreed upon price with about $6,000 worth of repairs made. Of course, the following year, when it went in for an annual, there's always surprises on that first annual. After you've owned an airplane, there's just always a surprise. And I think the annual on that ended up being like $12,000 or
I
something.
I had the same thing on my AirCam. Of course, it was an experimental built
Right.
airplane by a first time builder, and it was a terrific airplane. I liked it. But the first annual condition inspection was over $12,000.
Right.
You'd be stuck. Well, maybe not you because you've bought and sold airplanes, but the average person buying their first airplane or their second or third might be astonished at the cost that can be. I have a friend that bought an airplane once that had fuel bladders and had been assured when they purchased the airplane those bladders had been replaced. But during an annual inspection, going through it, those bladders were installed in 1959.
Yeah. So they were replaced in 1959.
Yeah, so
So it's not an untrue statement.
yeah, and that's an expensive thing getting those out of there.
Yeah.
So you brought this up twice in one way or another. One of the reasons you do a pre-buy beyond the insurance thing is let's know what we've really got, and if necessary, we renegotiate the sale because we can still walk away. Yeah, I might have spent $1,000 or $1,500 on the pre-buy, but I'm not locked into doing thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of repair I didn't know about. Just that is a pretty good reason because you could very easily save the cost of the pre-buy in a renegotiation.
Yeah, that plus the fact that, maybe you've put a deposit down on the airplane, and depending on the integrity of the owner of the airplane, the seller, you may or may not get that back. You can certainly, in the pre-buy agreement, you can negotiate that you get it back if the airplane is not satisfactory. But
Mhm.
again, you're kind of depending on the integrity of the seller to return the money because he's the one that's got it at this point. And how much, how if it's $300 or $400, $500 or something like that, I'm certainly not going to lose a lot of sleep over it. I don't mean to make it sound like $500 not a lot of money, but do I want the hassle of going to court? If the person may be out of state. I mean, okay, I'll chalk it up to experience, but so it was a $500 expense, but it saved me $100,000 in repairs.
Yeah, yeah. Another really, really important reason to consider a pre-buy and get serious about understanding what it is and knowing who you want to do it is if you're financing the aircraft, the bank's pretty much going to require that.
Yes,
And
certainly.
and they want a real pre-buy. They're not looking for a squawk list. I once looked at an RV9 that I was very seriously looking at buying. I was going to finance it. The bank did want a pre-buy inspection. Totally fine. And I hired a young guy who had just started his own shop to do the pre-buy on it, and he was a good mechanic. He really was. But he wasn't really up to speed on what a pre-buy was. And I ended up getting a text with basically a squawk list. Well, that's not a pre-buy. That's not what the bank's looking at. They're really looking at something that approximates an annual inspection without the repair work,
Right.
just the inspection portion. What state is this in? And Pat, that's the kind of thing that really the bank is trying to cover its butt, but they're also trying to cover you. Where let's look down in that engine with a borescope. Let's actually get under the skin and look through the inspection panels. Does it have corrosion on a spar? Are there control cables that are in rough shape? Like you said, is there an illegal repair to a control surface? All those things may slip right by a potential buyer, especially when they're excited because it's a pretty airplane.
That's right.
But your mechanic has no emotional bond to this at all. They're just looking at it, and better than that, because they're a professional mechanic, they may know the weak spots on that particular airframe or engine and what exactly to look for and give you a ballpark on what would it cost to fix that.
And that actually brings up an interesting point as well. There are a lot of airplanes out there that are kind of orphan airplanes anymore. Grumman Tiger, for example, it hasn't been made for a number of years. The Belenka Viking hasn't been made. The Super Viking haven't been made for a while. Has a wooden wing
Yeah.
and fabric covered. Well, there are some folks around the country that specialize in those kinds of airplanes. There's a Grumman specialist here in Texas. In fact, there's a Belenka specialist here in Texas. There are people that literally come from all over the country to have those people work on those airplanes because they know things about those airplanes that um, I don't want to say that every mechanic doesn't know, but um, there are some unique things about those two airplanes in particular that that a mechanic who's never seen those airplanes before may not know to check.
That's absolutely true. People don't really think of it in the aviation world, but if you own a Chevy or a Ford, going down to the local Jiffy Lube for an oil change is fine. But
Yeah,
if you own an Austin Healey, you
yeah,
might look for a specialty shop. And that's the same kind of thing
yeah,
because, we mentioned before, like I really like Stinson's, but not everybody works on a Franklin engine. It's a very different engine than a Lycoming
yeah,
or a Continental, and it's harder to get parts for many of them. So knowing that kind of thing is a big deal when you go to a mechanic and say, what kind of condition is this really in before I buy it? Let me have a list of everything is looking good. And I will tell you, we have a mutual friend who went and checked out an airplane that was rebuilt at one point, totally restored,
right.
went and checked it out, found out it had the wrong engine in it. It's not the one that was on the type certificate data sheet. That's a big deal.
That's a huge deal. That's a huge deal. What you were talking about and what we're talking about as far as mechanics, maybe not quite being familiar with it. It's not really an aviation story, but I've got a good friend that has a Rolls Royce. And he was out of town on vacation once and he dropped the Rolls Royce off at his mechanic and said to change the oil. And the mechanic said, "You want all the oil changed?" And my friend thought he was just being funny, right?
Yep.
Yeah, of course I want all the oil changed. Well, that car is entirely hydraulic.
Hmm.
So he changed all the oils, all
All the
the,
fluids.
ended up with a $1,200 oil change.
Yeah, you got to know what you're asking for. But there's so many horror stories out there,
Yeah.
and not to freak anybody out, but you and I have both seen them where we've been shopping for an airplane and found the one we thought we wanted, and turned out it wasn't. I was working with a couple recently who were shopping for an airplane, and they found a 172. They had made the deal. They're ready to plunk down the check. Everything's good, and I agreed to fly it home from them because neither one of them is current.
Right.
Florida's a big state. Long drive out to this grass strip to look at the airplane. They go off to talk to the seller, and I go look at the airplane and start getting ready to fly it. And I find corrosion, and I find oil leaks, and I
Yeah.
find kind of enough things that I'm like, I'm not going to fly this airplane. I
Yeah.
just don't think it's safe. And
Yeah.
it's very uncomfortable to go knock on the door and say, by the way, can I see you for a minute? I'm not going to fly this. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy it, but I'm not going to fly it.
Right.
That's an awkward moment, but that was one of those things where a pre-buy would have helped. And to their credit, they got a pre-buy on the next airplane they were looking at, and they actually hired a guy who comes to you, and it's not inexpensive, but they found out exactly the condition of the airplane they were looking at, and they were able to renegotiate the price down several $1,000s because it wasn't quite in the shape the seller said it was. And the
Yeah.
seller's not trying to get one by you. They may not know either. They're selling it. They're not really looking at the maintenance.
The other thing that's important, I think, Jamie, as we wrap this up in a little bit, is to try to find a mechanic that is a neutral third party, someone that hasn't worked on that airplane before, someone that doesn't have a vested interest, and perhaps this mechanic is the person that has done all of this owner's maintenance, including the airplane that the new airplane this owner is about to buy, and now the mechanic tells the buyer, who is really not his client, not to buy this airplane, and now he screwed up the relationship with his longtime customer. So it's an inelegant way of saying find a disinterested third party to do the maintenance, or a mechanic that is your fiduciary, not the sellers.
You're exactly right. I would never use the maintenance shop or the mechanic who normally works on that airplane, the one who did the last few annuals. And of course, I think I was once looking at a tri-pacer out of
Mhm.
state, and the owner had died and a relative had it, but they knew nothing about it. Turned me on to the mechanic, and the mechanic just raved about it, what a fantastic airplane was, and how he had put all this work into it, and the owner absolutely loved it. It's just in prime shape.
Yeah.
And at the end of the conversation, I was like, great, I'll make a deal. I've got a friend up that way who can pick it up for me. And by the way, we have a mutual friend who told me to say hi to you. So, and all of a sudden the whole thing changed. He said, you don't want this airplane, because now he knows it's going to come back. And
Yeah.
he's not necessarily being a bad guy. As you say, he's serving the family of his dead friend and client.
Right.
That's where his allegiance is, not you, the total stranger. So
Yeah.
good
I agree.
advice, Pat. You're pretty sharp.
I learned everything I know from you, Jamie.
Well, thank you so much for suggesting this topic. And I do think it's a good one. Pre-buy inspections are something that go right past people. And man,
Yep.
you can make an enormous mistake by rushing into that purchase, or trying to save a couple bucks by not doing the pre-buy. So with the Jamie and Pat seal of approval, when you're looking for an airplane individually or in a co-ownership or in a club, get the pre-buy. Use your own mechanic and get a real pre-buy report so you know exactly what you're buying. Does that sound good, Pat?
I'm with you, buddy, all the way.
I think we can bow out now and say we've done our duty to the viewing audience. Folks, thanks for watching. Leave a comment down below if you've ever bought an airplane and had a pre-buy that went particularly well or poorly. The story's probably worth telling. And we'll see you back here next time. And of course, you got to click the like button. Otherwise, Pat will start crying, and it's sad. You don't want to see that. Catch you later.
Adios.